Welcome back. We're talking about foreign investments in Latin America. Let's get back to our panel. And Victor, I want to get to you and talk about the nature of the relationship that China has with the developing world. And something that we hear very often is that Chinese investment, the Chinese relationship with developing countries comes with no strings attached. That's very different from the kind of investments some of these countries get from organizations like the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, which place a lot of conditions on the aid that they give. Does that put China in, let's say, a major advantage when it comes to its investments?
Yes, indeed. I think in China's relations with all the countries in the world, especially the developing and emerging economies in the world, including those in Latin America, mutual respect is the cornerstone. That means, politically speaking, despite of all the differences between China and some of these countries, we need to show utmost respect for each other. We need to deal with each other as an equal, rather than one country looking down upon another country or lecturing upon the other country or try to impose its own value system on the other country. And that prevails in China's relations with all the Latin American countries. This kind of mutual respect and treating each other as equal is the cornerstone of China's diplomatic relations with these countries, as well as in the economic and trade relations with these countries. Now, just now, one of the distinguished panelists mentioned about commodities being a very important part in China's relations with Latin America. Indeed, but China also has very important commodities relations with many other countries, including with the United States, Canada, and Australia, for example. Don't forget, the first shipment of exported LNG from the United States eventually ended up in China. And it's not surprising to expect that China eventually may become a very important importer of LNG and crude oil exported by the United States. Therefore, I personally see no problem in China and Latin American countries' economic relations with a focus on commodities, and it will remain a very important focus going forward. However, we also need to focus on the industrialization drive in these Latin American countries and the good quality jobs created as a result of the Chinese investments and the huge market provided by China for many, many things produced in these Latin American countries. And I hope this kind of mutual engagement, which creates a much brighter future and higher level of hope for the companies and people and societies at large in these Latin American countries, are a driving force in China-Latin American relations. And this is also a big cornerstone upon which the brighter future of economic relations between China and Latin America will be built upon.
Right. Ambassador, is there a feeling in Latin America that the U.S. has left something of a vacuum with these inward-looking, America First policies on the part of President Trump?
Well, the magnitude of the change has certainly been acknowledged. But I think that the feeling is more like now there's a geopolitical dispute over the region, and that in a way it is the region, our region, Latin America, who I think has to take advantage of this huge opportunity that the world is offering, in terms of making more clear which are our goals as a region in terms of international partnerships, and also accepting this invitation from China, but thinking, as I say, of making a qualitative leap in the relation, meaning that we really need to build on those channels that our colleague from Beijing was mentioning, in terms of the industrialization of the region, the diversification of our exports. You know that now 70% of the exports from Latin America to China are primary products, 5 primary products. So we really need to diversify that. And something I want to highlight, because in my position in the G20, I experienced, is that China has always been, in particular with Argentina and other countries, a very good partner, not only at a bilateral level, but also at a multilateral level. So I think we need to include multilateral cooperation in this conversation as well, because it's not only strengthening bilateral links, but also trying to work together for a better world multilaterally.
And very quickly, to Cynthia's point about this relationship between Latin America and China going beyond trade and business, and, you know, it becoming more of a geostrategic relationship, that China is looking for influence there as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, this is very significant, for example, as I was mentioning, in the multilateral bodies. At the United Nations, China has been really looking for support from Latin American countries, and it has offered support also to some Latin American countries. For example, in the issue of the Malvinas question, which is very significant for Argentina. And of course, China is looking and thinking long-term, which I think is very good and strategically. And we as a region need to also look this relation and think in terms of a long-term partnership, building on the challenges and taking advantage of the opportunities.
Okay, I want to go to Charles. Charles, let's listen to what the United States Vice President Mike Pence had to say during a recent tour of Latin America. Let's watch.
Under President Donald Trump, the United States of America wants to trade even more with Latin America. We want to invest even more in Latin America. We want to bring even more of our business culture of entrepreneurship and innovation to all across Latin America, so that your prosperity and our prosperity will continue to expand together.
So, Charles, there we have the United States Vice President talking about expanding the relationship with Latin America. Do you see that being translated? I mean, that's the rhetoric, but do you see it actually happening?
Absolutely not. I think that China is investing massively into Latin America and into Brazil. The United States, I think that this rhetoric really goes counter what President Trump is talking about in terms of America first and isolationism and withdrawing from the world. And another factor that helps China and is not very favorable for United States and Latin America is that for so many decades, the U.S. intervention in Latin America has supported dictatorships that did not enrich the countries, but except for themselves. China, with its non-interventionist policies, is neutral. There is no leftist or rightist dislike or like for China. All the nations of the world, all the emerging nations of the world, have an aspiration to develop and for prosperity. And most countries see China as an opportunity for their enrichment of their nations and believe that China could be a great alternative for them to develop their nations.
Okay, interesting.
Just to say that, you know, China and the United States go about both political and economic business in very different ways. In the United States, I think there's still a great deal of interest in the U.S. private sector in investing in many countries of the region. I mean, certainly in Mexico, where the bulk of foreign investment has taken place, but also the levels of foreign direct investment throughout the region have been quite substantial and have increased, actually, with the signing of bilateral trade agreements, which the United States has with most, not all, but most countries of the Western Hemisphere. Whereas China, whether the distinction between, state enterprise and the government is a different kind of animal in essence, where the United States government does not invest in Latin America, is encouraging its private sector to do that, and the private sector is quite eager. So I think that we have to keep in mind the different sort of form of political and economic organization in both countries.
Okay, Victor, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it is a fact that China is fast becoming the largest trading partner with Latin America. And in the years and decades to come, this leading position will be further strengthened. However, from the Chinese perspective, we have no problem at all if the United States increases its investment and trade with Latin American countries. The more, the better, as a matter of fact. However, one point of advice to the United States and President Donald Trump, that is, in order to really increase your trade with Latin America, treat Latin American countries as an equal. And don't lecture the Latin American countries, don't lecture the people in Latin America. And when President Donald Trump talks about building a wall, keeping Mexico away and asking the Mexican government to pay for the building of the wall, this is really very outrageous. It does not generate goodwill in Mexico or Latin American countries towards the United States. Therefore, I think both China and the United States can have more businesses to do with Latin American countries, but we need to look at what exactly the Latin American people want. They want to enjoy full respect, they want to be treated as an equal, and they don't want to be lectured upon as a second-class country or second-class people.
Go ahead, Cynthia, very quickly.
Sure. I certainly would agree with Victor in terms of the desire of people in Latin America to be treated as sovereign equals. But I think it's important to understand that China is a competitor with a number of countries in Latin America. It's not just that there is this wonderful mutual interest. Countries like Mexico, Central American countries, have had their domestic industries and domestic, production capacities really undermined by competition, from Chinese exports. So it's really, I think there's an important distinction between the countries of South America that have commodities, agricultural commodities, energy, and countries that have a large manufacturing base, like Mexico, where, things are changing dramatically, but at least initially there was an important distinction.
Right, and Ambassador, one final question, and that is, how this kind of investment translates to helping people on the ground in Latin America. Let's take the Chinese investment that's taken place, say, in the last decade in America. How has that contributed, say, to job creation?
Well, as it was said, the U.S. is still the largest investor in the region, and I think that's important to bear in mind. China has been growing very fast in the last decade in terms of their investment, and mostly in terms of the financing of infrastructure projects. I believe in all these projects, it's really very important to make a big contribution in terms of jobs and quality investments to really think of the sustainability, long-term sustainability of these projects. These are projects that the region needs, that China is willing to cooperate with, and we really need to bear in mind that they have to be sustainable in terms of social inclusion and in terms of environmental requirements. And this is a challenge. It's a challenge for our countries, it's a challenge for China, and I think it's something we really need to work on in the future. It's not something that is given. It's difficult for everybody, and that's the goal.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. Chat with us about this or any other show on Twitter. We're at CGTN America. Or visit us on Facebook. That's facebook.com/CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.